This is Generous Theology. Today, Chuck and Brock examine a beautiful psalm that promises goodness and blessing, Psalm 128.
All right, my friend, we are live, we are engaged, we are in the process of having our chance to shine another night. I'm so happy to be here in discussions with you. And boy, what a blessing to go through these texts, Chuck. And if it is all right with you, I actually wanted to do this another psalm tonight for us. And if you have your scriptures, maybe I could ask you to turn to Psalm 128. 128. And this is, we had an interesting discussion last time about Psalm 129 and how there was some subtlety and some indirection that additional context from the scriptures would help you with. And sometimes the scriptures can hit you over the head with a baseball bat, as we would say when I was a boy growing up, meaning they can speak so directly that there's not any possible way of misunderstanding the text. And yet, sometimes scriptures can be very subtle, multifaceted, possibly even engaging in levels of indirection. And so Psalm 129 was one of those. And I think Psalm 128 is a chance for us to maybe look at something a little more direct. I'll just read from Psalm 128, and it's a song of ascent, and it goes in the New International Version. It starts off and says, "Blessed are all who fear the Lord, who walk in obedience to him. You will eat the fruit of your labor. Blessings and prosperity will be yours. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your children will be like olive shoot around your table. Yes, this will be the blessing for the man who fears the Lord. May the Lord bless you from Zion. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. May you live to see your children's children. Peace be on Israel." And now that's a beautiful psalm to me, Chuck. And if there was some sublimity and nuance in 129, 128 is definitely hitting me over the head like a baseball bat, as it were. And I just wanted to give you maybe a chance to open up and see if that was a good characterization for you, and what were some of the points that you noticed early on the way.
Yeah, first of all, it's neat. We've been working backwards to some extent through some of these psalms, but we've been in all these psalms of ascent, and as you pointed out at the beginning, and these are all songs, as we've talked about before, that the Israelites would sing together as they walked up the hill to go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was up a high elevation, and they would march from wherever they were around Israel and Judah and go up the hill up to Jerusalem, and they'd sing these songs. And while there are a number of different themes in these Psalms of Ascents, 129 was a little bit different than some of them, there are also a lot of these that just really speak of blessing, the blessedness that comes from fearing the Lord and walking in his ways. And I know Psalm 127, which comes even before this one, is one that is fairly well known, I think, is fair to say. And 128 may not be quite as commonly sung or recited, but it's still a very good one. And it also seems to carry over some of those themes from 127 as well, that children being a heritage from the Lord, God's blessing the work of those who trust in him. And so Psalm 128, as these people, you can almost hear it as they're marching up to Jerusalem, and they're marching up that hill, going up the roadway, and here they start with, "Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, walk in his ways," singing it as they walk their way up to the city of God in Jerusalem. It must have been one of those, I imagine that, I don't know whether they sang them in the same order as they appear in Scripture, but if they did, you can even imagine this one, Psalm 128, being the culmination of a series of songs of ascent that really get into the fact that God is a God of blessing, and that when God's people walk in his path, there is prosperity and there is blessing that comes from that. There's nothing here that says that blessing is automatic, that it's this magic type of thing that happens. And yet, even though it doesn't say that, there is still a level of promise, whether it's in our lives now or whether it's in our life to come, in the new heavens and the new earth. Everyone who fears the Lord is ultimately blessed. So this is a very positive text.
Yeah, thank you for that, my friend. I really appreciate that the Lord spells it out, maybe to the nth degree or in such exquisite detail. There's something else that really hits me over the head here, and that relates to what is sometimes called the war between the sexes. In the culture wars of the last 200 years, and certainly in the culture wars in my lifetime as well, I think we've seen very interesting transitions in this sort of, what could you call it, celestial stage. And by that, everything in its place. And that's become very difficult to talk about now because of certain facts of history. And what I'm trying to say is this psalm portrays in a very godly and edifying way that an essential part of being a man in the Lord's framework, in the Lord's thinking, and in the prescriptive plan, an essential aspect of being a man or manliness relates to being a family man. And this is a really much needed passage for men to consider in these days. Chuck, in our parents' generation, we had this idea of the man as detached from the family. We had this evolutionary idea that men are about seeking as many partners to mate with and impregnate in order to propagate the species, this Darwinian aggression of male attention and energy. And as a result of that, we had what I would call a surgence of what I would call the Playboy cult. So this idea that being a man is recreational. It's being maybe not a playboy in the crass sense, but it is about a man playing with his toys in this reality. There was a bumper sticker very popular when I was growing up, Chuck, that said, "He who dies with the most toys wins." And I haven't seen many of those in recent years, but I know a lot of men thought that way to a degree. And I think and suspect that they've missed something crucial. This psalm identifies this aspect of, and it's speaking in generalities. We're not saying every man has to be a family man, just like every woman does not have to be a wife. But we're saying that this general sense from the Lord is that's the Lord's positive intention. And so we have this. What should you be interested in if you are a positive and non-toxic man, to borrow a phrase from the culture wars? And so the first thing that strikes me in this psalm right out of the gate is the fear of the Lord. Men, your blessing comes. Let's say your blessing starts when you fear God, because it is that fear that orients you to walk in obedience to Him. So says verse 1. And as a response to that religious impulse, God says He will bless. Blessings and prosperity in verse 2 will be yours. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your children will be like olive shoot around the table. And even not going as far as the Playboy model, the Hugh Hefner model, the James Bond model of the past 50 years, I can even think about, for example, some of the movie stars in Hollywood who had a lot of swagger, male energy and swagger. So think of John Wayne. When you have this idea that the man goes out and he conquers and he dominates and he advances his agenda, and yet this psalm presents such a beautiful family-sidedness. It's not merely a woman's role to be family-oriented. It's in fact crucial for the man to be so. Now, this is a sensitive topic, Chuck, and I want to make sure that we're clear about it here. I think you would agree, we're not talking about a chauvinism, but I think we're trying to talk about a godly complementarianism. How does that part strike you, and how do you think about these issues in a culture where these ideas are very stressful and attacked?
Yeah, it's interesting. I just got done reading with friends of mine. We meet for breakfast every other Tuesday, and we try to do some deeper reading issues in the church. And we just finished a book called A Time to Keep: Theology, Mortality, and the Shape of the Human Life by Ephraim Radner. And Radner is a Canadian scholar. I think he seems, if I recall correctly, comes from the Anglican tradition, maybe perhaps somewhat from a mainline background, but certainly his book doesn't fit a lot of the stereotypes that we sometimes have about mainline scholars. And one of the things that there's a couple of threads through this book. It's a lot of it is about mortality and the idea of death and how counting our days is an important part of what we do. But as part of that discussion, he spends a great deal of time talking about how God's desire for our existence in this world is as part of what he calls filiated relationship. And filiated meaning with family. You have that term filial piety that in Chinese culture is often used to show the importance of family and respect for elders within the family. And he points out that these filiated relationships, these family relationships, and some of them are sexual relationships of a husband and a wife, but they're and the results of that, the children, but also even going beyond that, just the various structures that make a family are just so key to who we are as a people. And regardless of where we fall on some of the cultural issues of the day, regardless of what even the culture that we live in, because there are certainly historical differences in eras of history, the way people lived. And yet within all of that, there is such an important, such a basic to the idea of family relationships, and that we're all connected in these family relationships. And family really does make it is a basic building block of how God has designed us to live together in relationship, and much more so even than individual relationships among ourselves, and much more so than other relationships beyond the family, more than ethnic or geographical or age type affiliations, which we have and can be important to us in certain situations. But how key to it is really this family relationship. And I think we see that in this psalm when the psalmist talks about blessing and prosperity that comes from fearing God. When he talks about the fruit of the labor of your hands will be blessed, and then he goes right into the family. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Children will be like olive shoots around the table. Thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. And then God will bless you from Zion. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. It expands beyond, at that point, beyond the family to the prosperity of Jerusalem and the whole community. But there is this basic building block. Family that is so key. So yeah, that's if people are looking for a deep and difficult and sometimes a little hard to understand everything that he's getting at, but really want to think deeply about some of these issues that come in these family relationships and what that all means, that Ephraim Radner book, A Time to Keep, is one that is, I think it's worth reading. It's one of those books that you have to chew on quite a bit. You can't just swallow it whole. You have to chew on it for a little while. It's like eating a fine steak. But worth the time. And I think there are connections here with what we're reading. Oh.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that recommendation, my friend. We're in need of wisdom and this kind of wisdom for today. So thank you for bringing that up. I want to do maybe a bit of a detour here over a secondary issue. And I talked about the psalm not being subtle. And of course, I'm going to take a maybe nuanced turn here. And Chuck, you can feel free to call me out for doing this, because I recognize that there are issues with this. But there's a tie-in here that I think is so compelling that I don't want to miss out on. And that is this. I want to talk about this concept of evil, but I want to talk about a specific subset of evil, specific kind of evil. So the kind of evil that I'm referring to is evil in a human perspectival sort of way. So Chuck, you buy a stock and you pay $100 a share for it, and shortly after you buy it, the company reports bad news. Oh no, it's calamity. Something very bad has happened, and possibly even fraudulent. And now your stock that you purchased only just recently for $100 is now trading for $10. You've lost 90% of its value. And as you walk home that night, and notice that you're the one buying the stock here, not me. I was being very careful. But as you walk home that night, it's very tempting, and everybody understands what you might mean if you were to employ the language and say something like, "Oh, what an evil has befallen me. Oh, what evil has come to me." everybody can empathize with you. And that's the sort of sense in which I wish to speak about evil. And in my case, it might be I'm walking down the road, having a nice leisurely walk, and I'm not paying attention, and I accidentally have one of those heavy bricks fall on my foot, and it causes me bodily harm. And as I have to go to the hospital to get the wound taken care of, everybody would understand that I would say something like, "Oh no, what an evil has befallen me." And so that's the sense that I'm talking about. From your perspective, losing that money on that stock, it was an evil. From my perspective, being injured, having my foot injured in that accident, it is an evil. Now, there's a different sense of evil that is, I would say, independent of perspective. And I'm not necessarily talking about that here tonight. I just want to be clear that I'm thinking about this perspectival evil. When I say what I'm going to say and say that, I want to link this psalm we're looking at tonight back to a very classic and famous chapter in Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy chapter 28. And the pericope here is the Lord will bless you if you obey. And so I will just briefly read through the blessing in the first 14 verses. Moses says to Israel, "Today I am giving you the laws and teachings of the Lord your God. Always obey them, and the Lord will make Israel the most famous and important nation on earth, and he will bless you in many ways. The Lord will make your businesses and your farms successful. You will have many children, you will harvest large crops, and your herds of cattle and flocks of sheep and goats will produce many young. You will have plenty of bread to eat. The Lord will make you successful in your daily work. The Lord will help your enemy and make them scatter in all directions. The Lord your God is giving you the land, and he will make sure you are successful in everything you do. Your harvests will be so large that your storehouses will be full. If you follow and obey the Lord, he will make his own special people, just as he promised. Then everyone on earth will know that you belong to the Lord, and they will be afraid of you." And so we come on down through the first 14 verses here, and you have this idea of conditional favor. Verse 13 and 14 sums this section up. "Obey the laws and teachings that I'm giving you today, and the Lord your God will make Israel a leader among the nations and not a follower. Israel will be wealthy and powerful, not poor and weak. But you must not reject any of his laws and teaching or worship other gods." Now, this is a long setup, and I thank you, Chuck, for being patient here, because the rest of the chapter talks about the Lord cursing. And so if we obey, we can expect generally to receive blessing. And if we disobey, we can generally expect to receive cursing. And so that's the flip side of this coin. And I want to get there. But before I get there, I want to just check in with you for the tie-in here. How 128 in the Psalms leads us back here to this Deuteronomy chapter 28, and this idea that in the case of the blessings, God himself agrees to advance our cause, maybe is a good general way to put that. He agrees to bless us and advance us and make us wealthy. But we're going to see that there's a downside to that with the covenantal cursing. And I think those are so important to remember, because in the culture today, most people think that we live in a reality that is largely driven by time and chance and randomness, and that there are no forces personally directed at you or myself. If something falls on my foot and I hurt my foot, that wasn't necessarily any personally directed situation that came to pass, but that was in fact the result of being in a personally directed world. And the same for your stock. And so that was a long intro there, Chuck. Thank you for being patient with me, but let me throw it over to you to just test on this link, see if this is the right way to go with this.